Welcome back to another quick review. Here I'm going to talk about two new movies I saw very recently that I both loved, each for completely different reasons. The first being The Iron Claw from director Sean Durkin. The film releases nationwide December 22nd, and I was very fortunate enough to have seen it early. The Iron Claw tells the fucking crazy true story of the infamous Von Erich brothers who made wrestling history together in the early 80s. I'm gonna be real, usually based on true story sports movies aren't my thing. I was held against my will many a times throughout high school, forced to watch Rudy, or Remember the Titans, or The fucking Blind Side. But every once in a while you'll get a Raging Bull or a Foxcatcher that tells just such an incredible, captivating story that just can't be ignored, and The Iron Claw absolutely fits that bill. I really just thought this was an awesome, fantastic film with a real hard-hitting emotional core. If you've had siblings especially, watching the Von Erich brothers on screen together just fills you with so much warmth. Their brotherly bond is communicated so well, and the genuine love they feel for each other is contrasted harshly by their immensely overbearing father. The acting across the board was phenomenal, the standouts really being Jeremy Allen White and Holt McCallany. Each of these characters feels so real, and there's such a strong level of physicality to their performances. You really feel the intense level of training they have to go through in order to fine-tune and craft their bodies, and the level of strain wrestling puts on them. The wrestling scenes were also very well done as well. I think at points they're shot a little too close, and the camera can be a little too shaky, but you still feel the physicality of the scenes, and they do a great job recreating the feel of watching an actual wrestling match. And as someone who isn't a big fan of wrestling, I watched one WrestleMania at a friend's house once. All the behind the scenes aspects of the sport, from creating characters, having to promote themselves, how matches are rehearsed, and all the politics of which wrestlers get to challenge who. It's all really interesting stuff that this film shines a light on. Although this film really isn't necessarily about wrestling as it is the main thread that ties through the core of the film, and the main emphasis of the story is on the drama and the conflicts that surround the brothers and the family. This is such an intensely tragic and painful story of a family tearing itself apart over greed. The idea of masculinity being a cage that traps these characters in plays a big part throughout the film, and I thought how the idea of toxic masculinity being passed down and perpetuated through generations, and how it navigated that theme using wrestling basically as a metaphor was quite profound. It does lean into the melodrama hard, but it definitely works. There are some very deeply emotional scenes, and one scene in particular fucking had me hands over face, bawling in the theater, almost to a cartoonish extent. Like I was on the verge of dry heaving and shit. I'm serious, this movie fucked me up a bit, which is absolutely a good thing. It's also a very gorgeously shot film. It's very well directed, and it really captures the late 70s, early 80s Americana feel very well, which I loved. It's not flawless or anything. I think the first half, which plays out mostly like your typical sports drama, can drag a little at points, but how brilliantly the story plays out, I kind of feel like it was necessary. I learned from reading about the film afterward that there was actually an entire sixth younger Von Erich brother that the film completely omitted from the story. I know a lot of people will get pretty anal about that decision to cut an entire real person out of the story, but to me, I feel like if it improves the narrative, creative decisions like that should always be made, and with an additional person to the main cast who wouldn't have added too much to the story, it doesn't really bother me. Also, Zac Efron, for as much as I loved his performance, it took some getting adjusted to his look. This dude looks like he prepared for the role by sleeping next to a nuclear power plant for a year. He's so big and wide, and his jawline is so straight. In every scene, he looks like a CG video game character, overlaid into the film. But that's just me, and it's not a real issue with the film. Putting some pacing issues aside as well, overall I thought the film was remarkable. It hit every dramatic note it needed to hit, and the performances were absolutely incredible. It looks beautiful, it fully does justice to this insane, tragic true story it adapts, and I absolutely loved it. Definitely see it when it hits theaters on the 22nd. Along with The Iron Claw, I also recently watched the newest Todd Haynes film, which came out on Netflix December 1st, titled May December. I knew absolutely nothing about this movie and what it was about going into it, and fuck, it sure has been a while since a movie made me feel this uncomfortable and gross. I mean, it's not quite on the same level as, say, like Mysterious Skin, but it's almost there. May December follows an actress named Elizabeth, played by Natalie Portman, as she meets and studies a woman named Grace for research, because Elizabeth will be playing Grace in a movie. Why Grace? Well, Grace became some sort of a controversial, almost celebrity after a massive tabloid scandal in which, when she was 36, had sexual relations with a 13-year-old, who she eventually had his child in prison, and who she would marry 3 years later. This is a film that deals with, like, uber heavy subject matter, which normally most people wouldn't even attempt to go near, but it's handled here really brilliantly. First off, I love how this movie looks. It's intentionally very minimalist and subdued. Everything's very stilted and plainly presented. It almost feels like the camera never even moves, and it's this cold, detached presentation that contrasts so harshly against the film's subject matter. This is such a deeply sinister but subtly presented film. The performances are unreal. It goes beyond just feeling like you're watching these big-name actors on screen, and it's more like you're peering behind the curtain into these people's lives. Charles Melton, especially, with how he perfectly captures the nuances of a man basically frozen in time, perpetually childlike, and with such an innocent personality, is so deeply unsettling. This film really creeps up on you, slowly revealing more and more about what it's ultimately about. It presents the full story to you so plainly and allows you to pick at it and pull it apart, uncovering more and more nuances. I'm gonna get into spoilers here, so if you haven't seen it, skip to this point in the video. More so than the film being about Grace and Joe's disgusting, groomed, pedophilic relationship, I think the film is more of a deconstruction of ego on the part of Natalie Portman's character, with her basically injecting herself into these people's lives and completely uprooting it for really just the sake of her own entertainment than for actual research. She clearly has an enormous ego and is entirely unsympathetic to either Grace or Joe, viewing both people as nothing more than the tabloid headlines that made them famous, drawing parallels between her and how we, as audience members, eat up true crime and crazy scandalous stories while ignoring the fact that these are still real people and these are their lives. This point being punctuated by how at the end it's revealed that the actual movie she's doing all this research for seems to just be a big Lifetime-esque, cheap and exploitative piece of shit that Elizabeth has convinced herself is something more important. The real tragedy of this film is how ultimately nobody cares about Joe. Nobody cares for his side of the story when in reality he is the real victim of the entire situation. All the tabloids, all the headlines, all the movies were about Grace, when Joe is the one who had his childhood stolen and his entire life ruined by this woman. And even though on the surface he seems fine with the situation he's in, it's clear he is deeply upset and angry about how his life panned out. And Elizabeth's appearance, prying into this relationship, is what brings everything to the surface. It isn't purely nihilistic, at least. There are little slimmers of hope for him, like how he's able to send his kids through to college and have them avoid the same fate he was dealt so young. And they still leave it open that maybe he will go on a trip with that lady he's been texting with, and he'll leave Grace forever, which would be for the best. And Grace, too, for as fucking evil as she is, it doesn't come from nowhere. She was also groomed at a very young age, given how she met her first husband when he had already graduated college and she was still in high school. And it's left ambiguous, but if what Georgie was saying about her brothers was real, it also would explain a lot. Not saying it excuses Grace's actions, she still is absolutely the villain in the story. So needless to say, I loved this film. It's so twisted and nasty, and it's so well presented. It's such an open-ended narrative that'll keep you discussing it for way after the credits have finished rolling, and that's always a sign of a really, really impactful film. Definitely also check this one out, but it's certainly not a crowd pleaser. It's not like The Iron Claw, which I feel like I can recommend to anyone. And those were my brief thoughts on these two films. Both are easily among my favorites of the year, so, great flicks. Check them out.